Good. All right. Before I start, I really want to thank Mela for having me here, Ari for getting me here, Kalitolimi and everybody else who's been creating this wonderful space for conversation and discussion. So today, one of the things that I want to start off with is ideas that I've been thinking about and working with for the last 16 or 17 years of my adult life. And today's topic is called The Crisis of the Republics. And what I really wanted to do was to think about what is the nature of citizenship, especially carceral citizenship, in the post 9/11 era, in an age where we have proliferation of borders, militarization. How do we rethink the ideas of citizenship, statelessness, but perhaps can we rethink the ideas of freedom itself? Does nation state still, and can it ever, has it ever provided people with the idea of the freedom that we need, they have? And can we actually rethink the ideas of freedom as something that is beyond the idea of nation state? Can freedom be a collective that we can bargain together in ways that are sustainable? Because the way we look at historically, those rights have not been given. In some ways, this could become a PhD thesis. So I'm not here to talk about all of it. But again, I think of this as an incitement to think and rethink many of the ideas that we hold within us and take for granted, but actually, once challenged, can provide us with many things. So I'm just going to start off with breaking down the title itself and then go through various ideas. I definitely don't want to put all of you to sleep, so the idea is to keep it really small, keep this conversation, the talk itself short so that we can have and open up this to larger conversations. Why Crisis of the Republics? It actually takes the name from a collection of essays that Hannah Arendt wrote soon after the 60s and 70s, but it's called The Crisis of the Republic, not the Republics. And what Arendt, again, this is not an ode to Hannah Arendt, and this is definitely not an ode to the great ideas of liberal democracy or Renaissance, but rather a way to start and critique these fundamental ideas that we take to be true. When people say freedom and liberty and equality, the idea is to go back and really ask whose freedom, whose equality, and what does equality really mean? So what does Arendt do in these three essays? The first was a question of on lying, where she tries to understand this idea of Watergate and what happens to the American presidency when the president lies to people. And that, I think, has a great significance today in some ways because we are constantly told that fake news is a problem. The truth is somehow being eroded. Again, the idea today is to challenge those ideas about what is truth. It's not just about Reagan and Trump lying, but what about the long colonial histories of violence, histories of struggle, histories of racial justice that are constantly being erased? So fake news might be a global liberal democratic problem for many, but that is also a problem of the privileged. Because for the longest of times, those who have been organizing on the front lines of activism, they've always been confronted with the idea of their histories being rewritten, their rights being taken away. So again, the essay that Arendt writes is a great way for us to go back and challenge this idea of what is truth? And is truth truly the fundamental basis of how we think about the future of citizenship and freedom? The second one that Arendt writes about is, again, on violence. She talks about how do we think about violence? Again, I feel that violence itself, the way we theorize it, remains deeply complicit in terms of justifying certain kinds of state violence in the name of greater good, but never really being critical of the systems and institutions in place that continue to not only incarcerate its own people, but how we think about larger questions of justice. Again, here it's not an ode to Arendt, but rather questioning how do we keep thinking about violence and critiquing violence, but never really challenging the fundamental systems and structures that benefit. We can talk about violence, but today one of the best performing stocks in the United States is stocks in which are run by prisons. And those stocks have done exceedingly well since Trump administration. Again, this is not a Trump predicament. This is something that's been happening for the last 70 years, is that increasingly the number of detention centers that have been built to house the refugees who are now coming in through the Mexican border have proliferated. And the companies that make the most money are the companies that build these prison camps. These are also companies that are deeply implicated within the building of what is called the global prison industrial complex. And that is also directly connected to your Guantanamo, to your Bagram. So these are not just questions of the United States, but how these things have again spread in the larger questions. And of course, Arendt also talks about civil disobedience, and she says, oh, we've criminalized dissent. But dissent has always been criminalized for any of the populations that have been fighting against deep structures, whether it's colonial policies, whether it's imperialism, whether we are talking about even the basic right to vote, the basic right to have an abortion, the basic right to make sure that people have health care. So in some ways, all of these essays that Arendt writes about still believes that the American form of government is a government form that's worth protecting, worth saving, and that these are the crises that will destroy this American form of government that we should all try to save. But today my question is that really the case? Are the current forms of government globally, now again called liberal democracies of Europe and the West and the United States, are these ideas fundamentally worth saving? That is the question. Can we remake a world in which we are not basing these ideas on liberal democracies that are fundamentally based on the ideas of slavery and xenophobia? Because what we often forget is that Renaissance was also the time in which slavery was in some ways codified, justified, and was the basis of labor extraction for creations of the great democracies of the West. Is that system fundamentally worth saving? Or is it worth just critiquing? And often that is the kind of incitement to rethink that I really wanted to talk about today. And again, people might have different opinions, but the idea is let's kind of go back and interrogate some of these main ideas. And the second question that I kind of wanted to unpack was, people often ask me, why is this obsession over 9/11? Is 9/11 some kind of a watershed moment in terms of thinking about global movements of resistance, global movements of incarcerations, or carceral citizenships? So in this point, I'm going to step in and say that, no, it's not. There are many, many watershed moments within the life, but I was too young for everything else. I was too young for the Kuwait War. I was too young when Somalia's famine was happening. I was too young for when the Berlin Wall fell. But what 9/11 really does for me is when I am stepping into my own adulthood. I'm young, I'm just leaving my high school years, and the world in some ways that is so protected for me completely unravels because I am, for the first time, a small brown girl traveling away to a different world in which I am no longer the top of the food pyramid. Let me again break that down for you in terms of how privilege works. So for someone who was born in what is a very secure, suburban, middle-class, educated family in a country, in India, who is upper caste, upper class, English-speaking, I am the embodiment of state privilege. What one would call white privilege is what I was embodied in India, in a place like India, because I had the privilege. Yes, I was darker, but apart from the color of my skin, which is a different question of colorism, I had the other privileges that a person has. I was born to the majority religion. At least I was born to a Hindu father, which is again the majority religion within India. I had access to resources. I had access to land because again, ownership to land gives you far more privilege than anything else I had, which also meant that growing up till I was 16 or 17, the idea that people did not have these privileges was an alien idea to me. In some ways, I had to step away from my own privilege and be a brown person in a predominantly white society where I wasn't in that privilege, that I could be picked up in stop and frisk. I could be picked up in any kind of immigration raid. Somebody would look at me and think that I could be someone who's implicated within the larger questions of what this was new war, which is the global war on terror. So why is 9/11 so important, at least for me, is that it's going back to people like Stuart Hall, who say that when we theorize things, it's personal. We take the personal lives of our experiences and then we take that and we make that into theory. And for me, everything that flows out of 9/11 is my personal moment of theorizing, because as a young person, I see the war in Afghanistan and Iraq happening. I see millions of people who will then get killed, but even as a 17-year-old, I knew that fundamentally something was wrong. But I did not have the intellectual, the textual, the political understandings to point out why was the system wrong. And now what happened in the aftermath of 9/11? Of course, there's the war in Afghanistan, and now almost 2 decades, we're close to coming to 2 decades. There is an acknowledgement that there were war crimes. The American soldiers had committed war crimes in Afghanistan. Iraq as a state was completely destroyed, which creates the way for organizations like ISIS. It also creates way for state fragmentation. It creates way for violence. But more importantly, it created a certain kind of carceral citizenship, not only for the people we were bombing and droning and taking as prisoners of war, but also the laws changed within countries like the United States. Executive power was again expanded. As a citizen, your civil liberties were crushed to a point where we still haven't recovered from it. While the Bush era completely laid a kind of siege towards civil liberties, the Obama administration expanded on those. With Trump, it's again this expansion. And this is not only in the United States. You see this happening in, I often like to call this, America is the world's oldest democracy. India is the world's largest democracy. And Israel calls itself the only democracy in the Middle East. And yet, it is in these countries, again, I'm not just isolating these 3 countries, but the same thing also happens in Europe to lesser extents, but in different, more insidious ways, because you have to understand that carceral citizenship also kind of shapes its way through local histories. What you really see is that the state increasingly, again, this is not a new phenomenon, it's a phenomenon that was born soon after the creation of the modern state, as we call it, is that increasingly we are no longer citizens. We are consuming subjects. We are surveilled, consuming subjects, and our value is constantly being mined. Today it's mined by the state, it's mined by Facebook, it's mined by Twitter. And what is then left of us? What rights do we truly possess in this day and age? Do we truly have the right to think of a world in which we can think of freedom beyond these limitations? Because today, dissent is criminalized. Again, you've seen this not only something that's new, you've seen Black communities being under FBI surveillance in the United States throughout all of the civil rights movement, and even today you see that happening. Today, people fighting against the pipeline that is being laid down, again, are criminalized, surveilled, arrested. A photographer friend of mine who has been photographing the Appalachian pipeline was arrested, and she had to spend $6,000 to just come out. And as a freelance photographer who works on issues that are important, $6,000 to just come out. And again, understand that she is white and she's female, she's educated, and yet for her, the cost is incredibly high. Imagine what happens to communities that don't have access to $6,000 to come out just because you're documenting what is happening in terms of the pipelines. And you see this throughout the world. You see this in many places. And what you really see in a country like India, for example, is that if the United States starts the idea of surveillance capitalism, idea of surveillance, biometric, today in India you have the largest biometric system that's put in place. They have linked it to the voter ID. They have linked it to free distribution of rice and other things, which means that if you cannot prove your identity, because in India you have a free distribution service in which countries most marginalized actually get free rice, sugar, and oil. So now, if you do not prove your identity because your ID is now linked to biometric, and often people from working backgrounds cannot have the same biometric data because if you do physical work, your thumbprint changes every 6 months, so they cannot validate it. And in India, they've actually had 13 instances of people dying of hunger because they couldn't validate their ID, and because of that, they couldn't get the rice sugar that's required. India also granted Israel the right to mine this biometric data that citizens are giving to the state. Now they have a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court of India in which they want to link social media accounts to biometric data. This might be appalling, but if any of you have flown into the European Union or left the European Union to the United States, all of you are automatically enrolled into a facial recognition system in which it's no longer your bioprint. They actually have enrolled you into a facial recognition system, which means the state has not even asked you if they can use your face to recognize it. So while it might seem appalling on the ground, what you're really seeing is every single day we keep conceding all of these rights. So what does this matter for us? Everything is fine. We share everything. We self-mine. We self-surveil. But how is this really connected to the global ideas of statelessness? What happens to refugees? Because those are not our problems, right? Because this is not something that we are directly affected by. A friend recently told me, who runs a hedge fund in New York, he tells me that, yeah, but I got to this country legally. You know, there are people who get to countries illegally. And yet, for us, the idea of using that somehow that people can be illegal itself is a language that we're so used to now. So how does this work? Because this global apartheid that divides people into different carceral citizenships are directly linked to what we do domestically. What happens to the 20,000 people who have died in the Mediterranean is deeply connected to the national laws that are put in place from the United States to Turkey to Israel to India to Europe. So what all of this really does is that we need to make the connection between what is global in terms of border policing practices, how we think of who can come in and who cannot, and how we think about our own national legislations that increasingly curb so much of what's happening within the state. Today, for example, in the United States, I could be stopped and frisked. Though stop and frisk no longer exists as a law, it can still be done, right? A couple of weeks ago, a bunch of young kids who were fighting alt-right fascists on a street because of some protests get picked up. One of the kids is actually undocumented, who was born in this country but undocumented. And the first fear is, how do we take this person? How do we get this young person who's 16 years old, doesn't have documents, out? Because now all of a sudden, ICE is already looking in. But what do we really think is that this story is pretty much exemplifies what's happening globally. These alt-right movements are far-right movements in all these countries. Every country now has a popular right-wing movement that's very, very powerful. And what do they really want is no longer to just think about, it's not about equality, it's not about wanting something better, it's about resisting the idea of equal protection under law. Most popular authoritarian movements, what they really want is not so much or better rights or better living. It's basically a response when communities are demanding for equal rights. It's a resistance against seeing the other person as equal or human, or that they deserve equal protection under law. And so many of these things are actually really tied together. And how are they tied together is that these ideas then manifest very differently in local racial geographies. Before I finish, one of the things that I really wanted to use as an example to think about this is how we're all globally implicated in these rights, is that the UN Charter, which again is deeply flawed, says that everyone has the right to a state. If everyone has the right to a state, then we shouldn't really have refugees or statelessness. And as we are predicting that apparently we'll have 15 million people who will be stateless in the next 10 years. 15 million, I'm assuming the number is going to be much higher. So what does that then mean for ideas of borders? What does it then mean for ideas of nation state? And what does it really mean that for us to think about this as a social contract? So now the question is, if state has been the single most all-encompassing entity that has consistently taken away the rights of people, do we still then agree to the system of a state as the only means of governing us, as the only means of giving us rights, or the only means of protecting the rights? Recently, in an Indian Supreme Court judgment, the Attorney General argued that as people, people don't have the right to their bodies. People don't have right for privacy. So the question is and again, India is a liberal democracy. It's a secular democracy, right? And again, so is the United States, so is Israel, so are many of the democracies within Europe. And yet, this argument is not far-fetched. If the state, when I say state, I'm talking of this amorphous idea that connects multiple states, genuinely do believe that citizens no longer have the right to our body, then what else do we have the right to? And if that is the case, then can we imagine a world in which we think of freedom as something that's independent of nation states? Who governs us, and how is that governing going to be done? Do we still return back to the idea of social contract, which itself is put in together in a time when the world was being colonized, in the world in which slave ships were being sent out in one time, and the next minute you're talking about the equality of man? What equality of man are we talking about? Are we talking about the equality of the white man and not even the woman, the white man, or are we talking about the equality of communities that have been colonized and racialized? If that is the case, and assuming that we can think of a collective freedom, a way of governing ourselves, a way in which we don't become capitalistic subjects, a way in which we are not just surveilled and mined for our data and for our information and for our bodies, then how do we imagine this new world? Is that going to be a world of nation states? But then the nation state has already proved consistently that it's a broken nation state. These nation states, these republics are all broken. They no longer serve the purpose, or one could also argue that they've never served the purpose except for the mercantile capitalistic class. Then how do we imagine the new world? Are we going to be communities that think and place freedom above everything else? Or are we still going to return to a hierarchical system in which all societies are fundamentally built in a way that some people always have more rights? That we just stop lying to ourselves that somehow we are all equal before whatever national constitutional book that is given to us. And now if we are to reimagine a political entity in which our freedom is more important, then our humanity is more important, that no one becomes stateless because we question the idea of state itself, then how do we rethink it? What new ideas do we need? What new texts should be written? And what new communities should be created? At this point, again, as I said, this is an incitement to think, an incitement to change our ideas, and I'll stop at that, and then perhaps we can have a larger discussion about other things that I've mentioned, and then take it from there. Yeah.